Good afternoon, folks. This is the lecture on mixing and shifting colorism. Keep in mind, remember that the syllabus has changed so that what would have been the lecture next week, the future of race and ethnicity, I ended up, I'm going to be sticking in the lecture on ethnicity, assimilation, and whiteness next week. But for today, for this week, I'm going to be talking about mixing and shifting colorism. This is a pretty short lecture. And this is kind of a part two of the idea of like where we're going to end up in 2050. Whether or not being mixed race is something that is going to be something that can end racism in the United States. Who knows? One of the major points that I was trying to get across in this is for us to recognize our mixed race ancestry today. So your average, 75% of African Americans have some sort of European ancestry. About 12% of white people in the United States have some sort of African American ancestry. Native Americans, most people claim to be Native American, have a lot of European ancestry. Your average Latino genome, which, to be honest, if you really want to look into the future of the Americas, the future of the United States of America, we should be taking a look at the Latin American world. And in particular, Puerto Rico is said to be the model for what we're all going to look like 100 years from now. Puerto Ricans have that mix of African, European, and indigenous ancestry. And just in case you were wondering, this is something that I would normally teach, that a lot of the difference between the United States and Latin America, which is, Latin America is, south, everything south of that Mexican border, is the colonial policies of the English versus Spaniards. I probably taught this earlier in the semester. But I just want to reiterate it again. Spain, when Spain sent soldiers to conquer South America and Central America, keep in mind that they only sent men. They only sent men conquistadores. So one thing I've really been trying to emphasize in this class is the nature of sex and the nature of sexual desire. And if you only send men, what eventually you think is going to happen? Those Spaniards started to make babies with the indigenous women and eventually started to make babies with the African slaves that they brought with them to some of these colonies as well. So this goes for Spain and Portugal, for that matter, and their policies. The English sent families. The English really focused hard on segregation, always maintaining separate lines between black and white, always maintaining separate lines between the European and indigenous populations and the African populations. The United States perfected the science of segregation. Again, compared to the Brazilian model. Remember, I always compare Brazil and the United States as being opposites of each other. Both had dreams of being white supremacist nations. The United States maintained its white supremacy and white superiority by separating and segregating out anybody of African descent, so that in the United States, anybody that had any African descent at all was considered to be black. Brazil was the opposite. They wanted to maintain white superiority by spreading the European gene throughout the population. Their answer was race mixing. How do you save the white race? How do you preserve the white race? You send that DNA into all of the population. In reality, today the Brazilian model is really the more efficient model, as I've been trying to emphasize in this class. If you genetically isolate any ethnicity at all, and you keep those genes separated from the rest of society, they're going to die out. You will die. You will not be able to survive in the future world because you will not be equipped to deal with the viruses and diseases that come along because you do not have enough genetic diversity. And so the reason I bring all this together is to talk about how, I've been mentioning that, I'm not a huge fan of colorblindism, but the reality is we are colorblind. We are very colorblind in our society inside of each racial group. You look at African Americans as a whole, light-skinned as I am, to his dark skin. I always like using Wesley Snipes. I have no idea if you guys know who Wesley Snipes is. We have a huge color gradation to describe black people in the United States. And we look and we see a black person. We don't see light, well, I guess we do see light, dark, and etc., but we still see African American. We are colorblind inside of the categories. Same with white. Red hair with freckles, to the Kardashian family, who's Armenian, but we still consider them to be white. Everything in between, Mediterranean, Northern European, and how like we are colorblind inside of that white category. We're starting to be colorblind inside of the Asian category as well. We are colorblind inside of each of those categories, which is very interesting, and it shows how we're capable of being colorblind. We're very much capable of it. But the whole point of this lecture is that I wanted people to recognize the mixed race ancestry that does exist, and how we smushed mixed race people into whole categories of black, white. In the United States, anybody with any African ancestry gets thrown into that black category. And it's interesting how we just went along with it and stayed colorblind inside of those categories. So next week, your final papers are due. Please focus on those. I will answer any questions throughout this week. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in a week. Take care.